When will this endless selling cascade in the crypto market finally end? Unbelievable, we're currently sitting at $103,000. And what you really have to say is, especially in these last 10%, people have completely lost hope. During that sideways phase, everything was still fine. But since this Friday, since that massive correction, nothing is the same as it was. We had another nice rally, but since then, we've been correcting non-stop for the past few days. People have completely lost their minds and no one really believes in the cycle anymore. The mood is really in the gutter. For some people, things are potentially not looking good at all. And just recently in the last video, I talked about why we're currently having a bit of trouble with Bitcoin going up. Of course, a lot of people didn't want to accept that again. But here's another simple example. A whale bought 10,000 Bitcoins at $1.54 each. That was 14 years ago. Today, he sold them for $1 billion. You can even see exactly how he did it here. Back then, he bought 10,000 Bitcoins and today he sold 10,000 Bitcoins. He made over $1 billion in profit. That's the reason why every time we experience a bigger upward trend, we then see a period of stagnation again. Because old whales are exiting step by step, the money is being shifted to institutional investors since they're actively accumulating here. And that's definitely something that's holding us back a bit. However, it must be said that we've probably seen the biggest sell-off by now, at least that's how it looks at the moment. Because within the last 30 days, another 400,000 Bitcoins were sold by really big whales. But what you can see is that the sell-offs by major investors are currently decreasing. And that's actually a positive sign because if the long-term holders were selling more aggressively here, like they did during the previous two uptrends, then it could be heading more in the direction where you might say, okay, we're moving toward a bear market. But since you can see that the long-term holders are slowly, step by step, leaving the market, they're also not putting as much selling pressure on anymore, at least not as much as during this uptrend or that uptrend, which is already a good sign, because in the same way, we could potentially enter this euphoria phase if we see that most of the long-term holders, the really old whales, are out step by step. Then we won't have as much selling pressure anymore, and we could potentially rise higher. You have to mention this anecdote from the last video as well, otherwise yes, it remains absolutely exciting. We are here in the golden zone for Bitcoin where you can clearly say that we must not break down below this level. If we really do break below here, then this entire bullish structure would be gone, and we would potentially be heading toward a bear market. Of course, there are still a few things to look at in that case, and so on. That means we wouldn't immediately slip into a bear market, no. But that would definitely not be good at all, structurally speaking, if you look at the whole thing from a chart perspective. To add my personal note here, I think that what we've just seen was already the worst of the sell-off. Maybe we'll head toward 100,000 again, that's possible, but I think we've seen the worst of it for now, and that we're more likely to start rising again from here. Because even if we look at something like this here, up to 100,000, there would be another 2 billion that could be liquidated here. Until then, we could definitely fall again, potentially, but if we look in the other direction, just take a look. If we were to go back to the all-time high, the market makers would liquidate another $16 billion. How incredible is that? Just imagine that. That's why potentially the market makers of course want to fish on this side again, and they can only do that if we start rising again. So if you look at the whole thing from this perspective, it's definitely bullish. If you look at it here, we see that whales are still selling to some extent. Here we can see the delta between the whales and the retail investors. We can see that whales are still partially selling. But we also see that large traders are currently potentially going more long, which is definitely a good sign. That means they're still not quite sure which direction things are going at the moment. I'm going to keep an eye on this. According to my tendencies, we could potentially drop again to $102,000, maybe even towards $100,000. But the $100,000 mark should definitely hold because we also have a long-term support zone there. Specifically the 50 EMA on a weekly basis. Because this indicator has so far always held completely. Only when we broke out here did things shoot up steeply. It held here, and so far in this cycle, it has always held. And it was extremely important back then as well, because it more or less held here too. Here, it fought to hold, but only when we broke below it sustainably did we enter the bear market. So this support zone really should hold here. If it does, everything is fine and everything fits. Personally, I'm still bullish for the coming weeks because we still have a deficit in the market here. But the problem we currently have here, we need to talk about that a bit. Because, we're seeing rate cuts. We're seeing the US and China, they have a trade deal. We're seeing de-escalation. We're seeing the end of restrictive monetary policy and in part, confirmation of altcoin ETFs. But still, we're falling here, even though we've seen such positive developments. And I think the most important points have been discussed here. we're still not seeing a huge influx of liquidity because it's only from December 1st onward that this restrictive monetary policy will be stopped. We do have an M2 money supply that's been rising the whole time, but if you look at what's actually being added, it's not really significant. It's not enough to catapult us straight into a bull run. Without really large new liquidity, risk assets in the crypto market definitely have a harder time. You also have to say that sentiment and risk appetite are declining, especially because of these recent sell-offs we've seen. This October was tough. We had heavy liquidations, and of course that didn't exactly build trust. It actually took trust away from this market. And that's the most important thing. Both retail and institutional investors are currently defensive. They're waiting for the next bigger confirmation of the upward trend. We also saw that at the last Fed rate decision, Jerome Powell was a bit cautious, and we still don't have 100% clarity in the economy. But what has to be said is that the economy is slowly stabilizing, the fundamental data is gradually improving, and market psychology is still lagging a bit behind. And that's exactly the kind of thing that strongly reminds you of a bottoming process. We're in a boring market phase. Low confidence, low liquidity, sideways movement. In the past, these were often the times when you could catch the bottom well. And I don't want to sound super bullish again or anything like that. It's simply a fact that we've just had problems. That's why gold has risen so much. But now we're seeing a correction which is important. We can see that the S&P 500 has also outperformed the crypto market, and I tend to think that this liquidity is now flowing out of gold and fueling the upward trend in the S&P 500. I believe we'll catch up with that in Bitcoin, and that makes me optimistic. What I also find interesting is that the higher we climb here, the more irrelevant retail investors become. Here, we can really see the retail volume. We can see how high it was back in the 2022 cycle, and actually, retail always followed along. But you can see that, for example, last year, we definitely still had retail involved, and here as well, at least to some extent. Right now, retail is completely out. We're climbing here, and normally, when that happens, retail would jump back in as well. But retail has more or less given up. Retail is becoming more and more irrelevant, and that's what we're seeing right now, which is of course interesting in this market. But personally, I just can't imagine that the big players will let that opportunity slip by. I think they definitely want retail to be involved here, because that could of course drive prices even higher for us. And I don't think they'll let that pass them by. That's why you just have to say, in the past few months, retail has become more and more irrelevant. Nevertheless, I tend to think that it will come back and that it will definitely also boost the markets, because it would simply be foolish for the big players not to take advantage of this opportunity. That's what a chart like this shows us, where we can just see the retail volume. But it also shows us something like this. Here we see the social score in relation to the Bitcoin price. We're really in a zone right now where you have to say there is by no means any retail. We're still pretty much irrelevant in the market. The big crowd isn't in yet. And I just can't imagine that the big players would let this opportunity pass them by this time. Why should they let it pass them by this time? I just don't get it. That's why I simply believe they'll lure retail investors back in again, at least as many as possible, and I think we could then see that reflected in the charts, because right now, we don't see it at all. Otherwise, friends, that's pretty much my opinion. As always, be honest. Feel free to write what you think about it, but please don't be as stupidly pessimistic as some people here in the comments, who just say things like, all YouTubers are talking nonsense or something like that. If you can justify all of that and so on, then I'd be happy if you could explain why, in your opinion, this whole thing is over for you. Because potentially, of course, it's possible that this was already the bull run top and we're now heading into a bear market. If that's 100% the case for you, theoretically, that's possible. Personally, I just don't see it yet, or rather, there are still a few other things that would have to line up for me. But it's possible,